Hello, very warm welcome to you as you join us for this book launch today. This is an event coming to you courtesy of the Regent College Bookstore, one of the finest theological bookstores in North America, if not in the entire cosmos. And we're here to celebrate today the launch of not one, but two books, the publication of two books by Eric Peterson, Letters to a Young Pastor, Timothy Conversations between Father and Son, and Letters to a Young Congregation, Nurturing the Growth of a Faithful Church. Both of these are published by Nav Press. Welcome, Eric, and welcome to our audience. And if you have any questions for Eric as you're watching this live event, you're welcome to email us at questions@regent-college.edu. And as the conversation progresses, we'll try and put some of those questions to Eric. Eric is the pastor of Colbert Presbyterian Church in Washington State. I hope I've said that right. Is that Colbert, not Colbert?
Right. Yep. That's right.
As in the personality, Colbert Presbyterian Church. And he planted this church, I think I'm right in saying, more than 20 years ago. And it's this church to which the Letters to a Young Congregation are addressed. The other book, Letters to a Young Pastor, were all addressed to Eric, and he's written the introduction. But the letters themselves were penned by Eugene Peterson. Many of us know Eugene Peterson as the guy who wrote the Bible, or rather the translation of the Bible that he called the Message. And he's famous for that. But Eric was Eugene's son. So to Eric, Eugene Peterson was dad, not some famous author. And he's had an incalculable impact on the whole of his life and ministry. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that today. So Eric, congratulations on bringing these two books out together. You obviously intended to do this, to bring them out as a pair. Can you tell us about that? What your intention was in doing that?
It was a bit of an evolution, I think, in the way that it came about. These letters from my dad to me were never intended or designed to be published. But at some point, within the last, 2 or 3 years of his life, I still found myself going back to them and finding kind of this enduring wisdom about them. And so I just ran the idea by him at one point, and asked him how he would feel about those being shared with more broadly with the public. And he agreed. He thought that would be a good idea. And it was, I think it was the last winter of his life. He and my mother lived with us. We had added on an addition to our house, this apartment, self-contained, intending to kind of try this out. This was to be like a 6-week trial for some future event when they might move in with us, so they would have a point of reference. And so we were talking about maybe sharing these, getting them published. And so I just started transcribing them. His letters to me, I just kind of put into my computer, and then I would come home from work and bring them their mail and sit on the floor and just check in with them, and then read 1 or 2 of those letters out loud. And this is a point where my dad's cognition was starting to fail a little bit. And after I'd finished reading one, they mostly ended with "Love, Dad," or "The peace of our Lord, Dad." And I would, say that part, and he would open his eyes and he'd say, "Wow, that's really good." And I said, "Well, you wrote it, Dad." "I did." "Well, it's still really good." And so that kind of reveals almost the objective assessment on his own part, because he'd forgotten that he'd written these, but recognized them for the enduring wisdom that they contained.
Yeah, I mean, you could have done this as a, kind of compressed the two books, and because so much of what your father is writing about to you is kind of addressed in the other book. Did you ever think about trying to merge the two things?
That didn't really occur to me. I really wanted them to stand alone, but to also kind of have a sense of being companions. We'd actually talked about sleeving them together at one point. But I just feel like it's important to, as a way to honor his voice, to really let his voice stand on its own. And so you really have to infer any part of his, that is, infer any part of my interaction with him in those letters.
So
I just really wanted his.
Sequentially, I suppose it kind of begins with the letters to a young pastor. It kind of, in the sense that you started writing the letters to your congregation after these letters to the young pastor started coming your way. So let's begin there. And I mean, you asked him to write these letters, right? You said to him, look, I know you've written books on, stuff and being a pastor, but can you write me some letters?
Yeah, I'd been ordained for 7 or 8 years, and I was starting this new church. It was foreign territory to me. The books that I was reading about church planting weren't really resonating with me. They were kind of gimmicky, and I was just feeling over my head, overwhelmed, and partly I think in fear of resorting to gimmicky stuff, out of a fear of failure, a desire to be successful. And he's the only person I really trusted, the only voice I trusted to help provide some guidance and thinking in order to do it with integrity. And so I was a little surprised. I was reluctant to ask him because he was busy at the time, and he just jumped on it and then was just very faithful in, the intervals are not really regular, but he was just very faithful in when the time was right, when it was time to kind of capture the essence of a conversation that we'd been having. He would write a letter, and I would just tuck it away in a file cabinet, realizing that I'll be coming back to this again.
Mm. We'll come on to some of the big themes that emerge out of the letters, but can you talk in general terms about what kind of impact they had on you? Because they're deeply personal letters. They're not, it's not some kind of detached kind of observations about ministry. This is very much from him as a person and your dad and the experiences that you're going through at the time. I mean, were there ever times when you felt deeply challenged by these letters or rattled by them, perhaps?
Yeah, I think to some extent. I mean, they were beneficial to me at a couple of different levels. One was the personal level. So my relationship with my dad, once I became a pastor, was kind of hidden from public view. That is, I didn't lead. There's actually a reference to in the letters about coming out of the closet, to actually letting people know who I was, and in relationship to him, because I found that if people knew that too soon, too early on, then it affected the way they viewed me. They would kind of relate to me vicariously or relate to him vicariously. And so that was just kind of quiet, hidden from view. And so these letters reveal the actual closeness and the intimacy that we experienced that no one really was aware of for those many, many years. So as you read the letters, you see how generous he was in his affection toward me. He expresses that pretty lavishly. There's pride, love, affection, admiration, which is pretty sweet, pretty dear. And it's almost embarrassing to admit that as a 40-something, 50-something-year-old, that was still important to hear and to read and to be able to retain and preserve. The power of a father's blessing is incalculable. Yeah. And so to have that captured still is meaningful to me. Again, a little embarrassing to admit that, but
Yeah, but it's a beautiful thing, and it comes through time and time again. And I just wonder if you were at all yourself kind of, did you have second thoughts about publishing these things, because they are so deeply personal, and this connection between you and him as father and son?
Yeah, I mean, I very much did. I didn't exactly agonize, but I thought about it for a long time, struggled, consulted with people, and I shared this with my best friend recently, who just read them, and I said it feels almost like showing off a little bit, like see how much your dad loved you. And my friend's response was, "Oh no, that's not at all the experience I had. I read that as a dad myself, and was instructed by your dad in the ways of relating to a son, to a daughter, the things that are, helpful, beneficial, meaningful in these more adult relationships." But yeah, I did hesitate a bit. I still feel a little bit not insecure, but a little reticent to have them out there because they are very personal. But the other level of benefit for me, and this is where I hope that it has a spillover effect and benefit to the company of pastors in particular, but other Christian leaders generally, is that those of us that are involved in church or parachurch related leadership roles, I just think there are seductive forces. There are lots of siren voices that can kind of lure us off track, get us off the way, the straight and narrow way. And I think these letters have a way of regrounding us and saying, here's the foundation, here are the essentials. This is the stuff that you have to just kind of keep coming back to, the foundations, the fundamentals, the essence of the way of being a church servant leader these days.
Mm. It's fascinating reading both books. For those who do know something about your dad and maybe have read some of his books, including The Pastor, it's fascinating the similarities between your own story and his story as a pastor, and particularly in terms of planting a church. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because there does seem to be something that is quite unique here about the kind of career, if you like, you've had and he had as a pastor.
Yeah, well, it's an astute observation. It's I mean, there are times it feels like kind of cliche, like I went into the family business because I'm a fifth generation pastor in this family. And so that was largely my reluctance. My resistance to heeding this call was pretty fierce, and mostly because I just grew up in this family of pastors generationally, and they were all really good. And I just thought, I can't do that. I'm way too young and dumb, immature. And so, coming into that. Into this vocation took some struggle. It took a while to actually own it as my own and to find my own voice in it.
And obviously your own voice matters in all of this, but you've learnt a ton from him. And that's very clear. I wonder if you'd like to read something from one of those letters to you.
Yeah, since you asked me, I found a little excerpt. See, I think part of what has been meaningful for me in this is just the reaffirmation that pastors are fellow disciples. We're struggling, we're learning, we're growing, and we figure it out as we go. And so to hear Eugene talk about this, and some of his own reflections and development in terms of his pastoral identity was really helpful for me. So here's Here's a piece of the fourth letter. I was reading a lot of John Henry Newman those days. After his conversion to Rome at about age 40, he decided to establish an oratory, a foundation of a few men who would work in the city. He chose Birmingham, an industrial blue-collar place. All his friends objected. He was the most prominent Christian intellectual in England, the best writer, the best preacher, virtually the best everything. And here he was, going into the obscurity and dullness and cultural intellectual waste of Birmingham, giving his life to these unpromising people. In a letter to one of these objectors, he wrote, "Birmingham people also have souls." That hit me hard. Yes, Bel Air suburbanites also have souls. It was a little mini conversion, and I started redefining every one of these people as a soul. It had the same effect on me as your insistence on seeing each person as baptized. It took Jan and me a while, but slowly we learned to set aside our boredom and criticism and distaste for the kind of lives they were living and deal with souls. I realized that suburbia may be the most godless segment of the population in the whole world, the most pressing missionary field, and settled in to making it my life work. All this came flooding back to me as we returned to Christ our King. It was like we had never been gone. The reconnection was immediate. All these so ordinary people, but each one interesting, with a history of suffering and struggle and worship and sin and salvation that turned out to be absolutely unique. Now, after the separation of 9 years, I could see something of what had happened as these people were treated through those years for what they really were. Not what the culture did to them or what they thought of themselves, but as souls. They weren't used to that. And when we came back to them, they were responding, I think, to that experience, that relationship. They weren't used to being treated with the dignity of souls. They were used to being treated as consumers or as victims, exploited and or condescended to. The sense of community that returned almost immediately surprised both of us, for none of these people meant much to us personally as friends. We didn't miss them when we left. And coming back, I didn't sense any sentimentality in them, that they had been pining for us or felt bereft of us. No, it was this intimacy that was a result of being treated as souls, and it was simply there as strong as ever. It was as if we had walked back into a company of people with no sense of break or interruption. The little kids had grown up, everyone was grayer, and the old people had shrunk considerably. A surprising number had gotten fat, which was something to do, I think, which has something to do, I think, with being blessed, the, quote, weight of glory, but nothing else had changed. It was like being plunged into a sea of intimacy and gratitude. And I've thought about that since. I wonder if one of the greatest things that a pastor can do after the basics are in place, the preaching and praying and teaching, staying true to God and following Jesus, is to treat men and women with simple dignity. That act in itself perhaps does all that needs to be done to bridge the worlds of need and affluence, rejection and acceptance, suffering and prosperity, failure and achievement. We aren't devising strategies on community or evangelism or mission, but on something far more basic. Baptism, image of God, souls. The dignity of souls created by God. Virtually nobody in our culture does that, whether in or out of the church. They are reduced to consumers and resources and victims, defined by their problems or their status or their function. We pastors, at least, have the context and vocabulary in which we can treat them with the dignity of souls.
Yeah, that's great, Eric. Thank you very much. Yeah, profound stuff. So just to fill in a little background, Bel Air is this region, is Baltimore, yeah? Is it in Maryland? It's and Christ the King was the name of the church that he planted, and to which they returned some years later. So, and of course, that was the church where you grew up, right?
Yeah, literally grew up in that church because before there was a building, it was in our house. And so I grew up in the church.
So this idea that he's got, that he puts forward here of souls, the people of souls have Birmingham, people of Birmingham have souls too, yeah, there are some people who would kind of argue with that, I'm sure, even today. But the whole idea that he's putting across here is a kind of, he's been quite countercultural, isn't he? He's pitting that against the identity that people have of themselves as consumers, as just kind of people who are kind of getting through life, and maybe the church has treated them as well, just kind of people of a particular economic unit, or of a demographic, and has gone after them in that sense. But your father was kind of talking about souls as this deeply countercultural understanding of the person, which is fundamental to ministry.
Well, that's precisely right. It's fundamental to understanding how Christ is at work in transforming us. If we don't have the ID accurate, that is, if we don't understand who we are, then it's impossible to live a meaningful life. Identification is inextricably related to purpose. And the culture, particularly the North American culture, is, it's a huge propaganda campaign to convince us, persuade us that our value is tied up in how much we can produce, how much we can consume, how much we can acquire. And to some significant degree, as you alluded to, I think the church has been complicit in that messaging. And so a recovery of something as fundamental as Paul just refers to the people he's writing to as the saints, to all the saints in Ephesus or Thessalonica, so on. That's the primary, fundamental, holy identification. And that's what pastors get to do, is to do the work of recovering, re-identifying people who have been victims of ID theft.
ID theft, thank you. So, I mean, related to this idea of souls, is his notion of the ministry. I mean, we already alluded to the fact that these are deeply personal letters, but that was his notion of ministry as well, wasn't it? That the ministry is deeply personal and has to be and needs to be in a depersonalized context. I mean, so some of this stuff about consumption and being just in this kind of machine-like culture is that we become depersonalized. And part of his vision for the ministry was to reintroduce a personal dimension to life.
Right. I mean, the damaging effects of when you think about people merely as resources, and that was one of the sort of the dirty words. That was a word on his blacklist. Don't ever refer to people as resources. That's that's a reification of their personhood, and it robs them of that holy identity. And so I think the thing that Eugene taught me, without even saying it out loud, I think what I've observed mostly was that pastoral ministry at its best is located in, grounded in, and grows out of the doctrine of the incarnation. It's in the flesh, it's personal, it's not distant, and it's not an idea. It's physical. And so the personal relationship is the fundamental expression of incarnational ministry. And so, I mean, I've gotten to the point where I don't feel like I'm somebody's pastor until I can identify the family unit by seeing their domestic pet. Because when I see the cat or the dog, then I know I've been in their house or their living room and have had some personal interaction with them. But it's that kind of level of personalness or intimacy, familiarity. And frankly, that's one of the things I love about being a long tenured pastor. I'm in year 24 here now. And, so I've got, history of being with people through their ups and downs. And that's, I wouldn't trade that for anything. That's just, that's rich.
It stands in kind of contrast to other visions of ministry, however, doesn't it? And I mean, one of the kind of big themes that keeps coming through in these letters is his kind of critique of or suspicion of a kind of a technique-oriented view of ministry and church growth even. Now, these things must be great temptations when you're planting a church. You want to use all the tools in the toolbox, as it were. And yet he seemed to be kind of constantly warning against that sort of that technique approach to church growth and leadership even, the cult of leadership. Are you there, Eric? I think we...
Yeah, I'm here, but our connection is...
Okay.
I'm here. It's just a weak connection.
Did you hear that?
But I think I got the essence of what you said. Yeah, I think your language of the cult of leadership is probably an appropriate one. And I feel like I want to be careful about criticizing other people, other leaders, other churches. I mean, Jesus said, if they're not against me, they're for me. And I think there are, there are many ways of being in the world and of kind of representing the kingdom of God. But I think my dad and I both agreed that there's some significant danger in adopting kind of ways of the world or business practices, kind of corporate models that champion things like effectiveness, efficiency, relevance, influence. That can get into pretty dangerous territory. And so we've just been, I think, both reluctant about that. But I'm sure I learned that from him. And I think his ongoing voice in my life keeps me in check from that, because even at this age, I think I'm prone to those temptations. I want to be successful. I want to be effective. And the pastoral way, which I think is also the Jesus way, is largely a modest way. It's pretty quiet, pretty hidden, pretty unimpressive much of the time. I mean, even as Jesus talked about the kingdom as it's moving in, he used mostly modest images. It's a mustard seed. It's a bit of yeast. It's this, pearl, lost coin, lost sheep, lost son. So there's a lot that just doesn't look very impressive. And I think for us to adopt the impressive methodologies it's treacherous territory.
It's really fascinating reading his uncomfortableness with religion in some senses, certainly with what he calls the club of religious professionals, and I mean refers to that a number of times. And then the way in which just even being around kind of too much of a religious subculture sort of made him feel ill at ease. And I wondered, do you share that? I mean, is that something that you kind of you also get? I mean, he talked in one letter about recognizing that you would never amount to much in a Presbyterian firmament. You kind of never make it in those circles. And and I'm thinking, really, I mean, here's a guy who was already famous by the time he was writing these letters. He was already a very well-known person, wasn't he, and writer and Christian voice. What do you make of all of that?
Well, I think we all wrestle with this, right? I mean, I think we want our lives to be significant. We want to make a mark. We want to make a difference. Those of us that go into the ministry are, wanting to do something, contribute to the commonwealth and to the kingdom of God. So I just think it's a wrestling match. I don't know very many people who don't struggle with issues of ego and ambition, goals, thinking about, what am I doing here? Does it make any difference? So again, I think both my dad and I came to recognize among the benefits of a long tenured pastorate is that you get to see some of those, payday maybe. You get to, see and hear stories of transformation, something that you said or did back then. I just got a letter from a former parishioner who said something along those lines. When my husband died, you came and you did this and you said this, and I have no memory of it whatsoever, but it was a turning point for this person. And so every once in a while, you get those stories, and that kind of, I feel like that carries me and affirms this kind of quiet, modest, plodding, day-to-day kind of stuff.
And a lot of the letters are about the kind of ordinariness of life, and I mean, rejoicing in that as well, but rejoicing in the rhythms and trying to find a kind of way of following Christ in the ordinary. But there are a couple of letters that relate to an incredible period in American history, in world history really, and that's letters that followed the 9/11 kind of attacks. And they were, I mean, they're obviously different. They're talking about something that has happened in the national life, political life, and he kind of divulges some things in that which relates to his feelings about American nationalism, about the kind of Christ and the flag type of relationship. How did you take that? How did you deal with those events yourself? And how did these letters land on your doorstep, as it were, in the midst of all of that?
Yeah, well, that was pretty early on in this new church development, this church plant that I was involved in. And, like a lot of pastors, I was at the time, not only horrified by what had happened, but somewhat encouraged, quite considerably encouraged by the swell in worship attendance and the kind of the interest in the things of God, which of course was not sustained for very long, more than a few months. And he was not in the pastorate at that time. So it was, I think he was framing it in the context of the civil rights movement, some of the big geopolitical movements that were occurring, how he was trying to be a faithful pastor in the midst of the social upheaval. But most of the time, in the 9/11 world, he was not really offering advice. Most of the time when I had a specific question of like, what do you do when you get to this point, or when you deal with this issue? And it seemed like he said this more than once. He said, I never had to deal with that. This is a very different world that you are pastoring in. You're just going to have to figure that out yourself. So that's the value of a return to the basics. and not trying to write the book on being a relevant pastor today. You focus on the essentials, the basic stuff, and then you figure out the contemporary pieces as you go along. So I think he was shaken by that event, most assuredly, but I think he saw that in the greater scheme of kind of world history and the geopolitical climate, and here's the next big thing that's coming down the road, and how is the church going to be a witness in the face of it? But it does, as the current North American, at least in the United States, it's this example of how the ways, I guess, that the church and society can kind of get conflated, can end up in bed together, where we can lose those distinctives, where you've got Jesus carrying an American flag. So I had people right after 9/11 asking me, why don't we have a flag, an American flag? Why can't we sing God Bless America or America the Beautiful, or, something patriotic? And I didn't at that time have a very sophisticated response, but I had an intuition that that's a line that I didn't want to cross.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Today, I would say it's important for us to retain our prophetic voice, and to have, clear boundaries. And in order to be both have a priestly and a prophetic voice, we need to speak to the principalities and powers, and speak as truthfully and lovingly and graciously as we can. But if we're prefacing that by pledging allegiance to the flag, then I think it compromises our ability to do that with honesty and integrity.
Yeah. One of the things that your father does in his letters to you is regularly reference theologians, obviously, philosophers, Soren Kierkegaard, and all kinds of novels and films sometimes as well. And there are a couple of things that really struck me. One was a novel that he mentioned that was about the pastoral life by a guy called Berryman, is it? Leaving Ruin, I think it's called. And then that really made me think about Gilead and Marilyn Robinson's novel, which is also about a pastor writing to his son. And in fact, so often as I was reading these letters, I kept thinking about Gilead. I mean, it's a novel I know very well and I love. And I love the way that Marilyn Robinson captured this pastor in all his complexity. He's not a perfect man by any means, but there's something about the tone in which he's writing to his son is so similar to Eugene writing to you.
That's an interesting observation. I know and love that novel also. I've used it in a number of ways, but I didn't make that connection. I think what struck me about that particular book of hers is how accurately she got it. She seemed to get inside the heart and mind of the pastoral life, which I just find remarkable. I just think it's a work of just genius.
Yeah. So let's move on to your own letters to a young congregation. You say in your introduction that towards the end of his life, you stood in for your father in various ways. You kind of delivered lectures for him when he wasn't able to, and helped kind of complete some writings, kind of ghost writing and so on, help him to meet his commitments. And you wrote, "I no longer know where his voice ends and mine begins. In death, no less than life, he has been both my father and my bishop." And yet, you clearly do have your own distinctive approach to things. theologically and pastorally as well, probably. How do you think of those distinctives? I mean, where do you see yourself as kind of not, doing things, over against him, as it were, but, where you plowed a different kind of furrow, you developed a different theme?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a little muddy. The lines aren't really clear for me. Eugene was and is the person that I most admire. He was always my hero. I think he always will be my hero figure. He's just a giant of a man in the most humble and modest of ways. So his influence on me is just profound. There may have been a couple of things that he and I disagreed about, but really not anything significant. So part of as I mentioned earlier, this distancing or the anonymity or the way I hid my own identity as his son, that relationship from public view for so many years was in order to find my own voice. I knew that I didn't want to be an echo or a mimic or an imitator of Eugene, even though I share his name. And I share some of his genes, I think, it's both spiritually and physically. So there's nothing in me at this point in my life that wants to distance, because I think I've done the work of differentiation, at least vocationally. I'm proud to be his son, and I'm really glad that we had a close relationship and that we were able to do some things publicly together in that last 10 years or so. We led some retreats and did some writing together and did some collaboration. So I don't know. It's a fuzzy line. I really don't know where his voice ends and mine begins. There are times when I hear something of him come out of me, and that pleases me.
One of the themes that comes through in your letters, and that he alludes to in his own letters to you, is the way that you made baptism an incredible focus, and it is an incredible focus of your kind of theological understanding, of your ministry, of your preaching and teaching, and I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, because obviously baptism is common to us all, but this is something that you've been excited by in terms of an understanding for the life of the church, the life of the individual Christian.
Yeah, I think that John Henry Newman mini conversion that he had regarding treating people, viewing them, relating to them as souls, the parallel experience for me was in this more sacramental lens, viewing people as the baptized. And so for me, my pastoral interest in this was to try to encourage the lived nature of this baptism. So over and against what is commonly held as this one-time event, like I can point to a day when I got wet, got baptized, got the diploma or the certificate. It sort of feels like a graduation, like I've arrived, I've done something, and it becomes this past tense. I was baptized back then. And what I've tried to do over the last couple of decades with this congregation is to instill a sacramental imagination, so that people have as their primary identity, not consumer, producer, or acquirer, or all the other things that the world is trying to say, that values us, but to say you're the baptized. You've been claimed by the Holy Spirit in the waters. And these are both lethal and life-giving waters. It'll kill you and it'll save you. So it drowns you from sin, and then it resurrects you in the floodplain of grace. And this is what most honestly and accurately identifies us according to who we really are, the children of God, the beloved daughters and sons of the Most High God, citizens of the kingdom. brothers and sisters with Christ. We're gonna rule with Christ. We're a priesthood and a prophethood of believers. So just all these magnificent ways the New Testament, captures these images, and the ways that they are, if you pay attention, really connected to all the allusions to water in the Old Testament, from the watery chaos to the flood, to the Red Sea, to the Jordan. It's just all, and Jonah. Every time water shows up, it is, I think, a prefigure to baptism.
Eric, I was privileged to come to your father's funeral, representing Regent College because of his long association with Regent, obviously. But it was a great privilege to be there. But you were leading it, and one thing I couldn't believe that you could do this for a guy that you clearly, it's your dad, but to lead a funeral and anyway and do anything, I thought was an incredible credible thing. It was very impressive itself. But more than that was this theme of baptism that actually came right through the funeral service, and you framed it all as, it was a celebration of the resurrection, the completion of his baptism. And I remember as the casket was leaving the church, a casket which you actually built yourself, I believe, as an ex-carpenter. But as the casket was kind of leaving the church, you kind of sprinkled water over it, as the waters of a baptism. What do you mean by the completion of baptism in this context? We're facing death. How is that the completion of baptism?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot. Let me just first say that leading that funeral was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. And I was just terrified that I was going to lose it emotionally. And I went back and looked at the video of it, and I'm grateful that it came out okay, but I was fighting the emotion the whole time. That was a tricky thing to do. So with baptism, again, this is kind of over and against that commonly held belief that it's a one-time event, which it is, but I think it gets unfortunately associated with like a graduation, like I've arrived, completed, done something. And so rather, I want to try to reframe that as a beginning point, as the establishment of a holy covenant. And like a marriage, you've got a covenant that gets established on a wedding day, but no one expects the couple to return from the honeymoon having figured out marriage or having fulfilled all their vows. Rather, you have a lifetime together to work out those vows, to practice the art of grace and forgiveness. And the marriage is not over until somebody dies. So similarly, baptism, which is the primary, the fundamental covenant, that's where we learn covenant relationship, establishes us in this relationship with God, who says, you're mine, and nothing's going to change that. And we say yes to that. We assent and do this kind of two-step dance of repentance. We turn from sin, turn to Jesus on a daily kind of basis, and we work out those vows, renouncing sin and evil, turning to Jesus, and we work that up over the course of our lives. So it's not complete until death do us part. And so that's the kind of imaginative way I'm trying to instill the concept in my congregation is you're working out your baptism just like you're working out your other covenantal relationships. And it's imperfect, but we keep coming back to the vows. We keep doing the dance. And we're not perfect until, it's not finished until death. Death finishes and completes these covenants that are established on earth. So I think there's great freedom in that. There's a sense of, permission to be practitioners, to be lifelong rookies in the life of discipleship. We're working that out, honoring our vows, honoring the identity, And so it's been gratifying to me to see how in my congregation they've come to adopt this language. And I'll sometimes, across the prayer chain of our church, for example, someone will say, "Thank you for praying for my Aunt Hazel, who's been on hospice the last couple of months. Last night, she completed her baptism."
Yeah. So I wonder what these letters. You're obviously a pastor who gets to preach every week to your congregation. Why the letters? Are they doing a different job, a slightly different job? Do they kind of work in a different way to a sermon?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think pastors are struggling with right now is in an age of pandemic, this COVID era time in world and church history presents all kinds of challenges. And I just find it such a gift to have a very, very clear sense of identity and vocational purpose. So I just never, or maybe seldom, wake up in the morning wondering, what am I supposed to do? I'm clear that my job, my vocational calling, is to keep a little congregation of people God attentive, God focused, and just paying attention to not only what God is doing, but then responding to that grace in the ways that we're living out our lives. So that vocational identity and purpose is as clear as ever. The challenges are how to do that. And the pandemic just makes us figure that out. So rather than meeting people in a sanctuary, I meet them online. But the work is the same. That is the goal, the telos of the vocation is no different. So the means that I've been given is primarily word and sacrament. But I understand the word to be more than merely preaching. It's the way that I use words, convey words, communicate the gospel. And so these essays or these letters are part of that kind of combo of word and sacrament. But the telos is exactly the same. It's I'm identifying myself as a fellow pilgrim, a struggler, working out my salvation with fear and trembling. I've got a place in the pew. I'm preaching to myself every week. And this is another way to try to communicate that, to instill a biblical imagination that hopefully is over time developing this cosmology, a biblical cosmology, a way of thinking and being in the world.
I wonder if this is a good point to read another from one of your own letters now, from the letters to a young congregation.
Yeah, this one I titled "Songs in the Key of Life," and I'll just read an excerpt from it. It turns out Professor Payne is a really effective teacher. As my professor, pastor, father, I learned a lot from him during the 55 years we shared life together, a lot of things for which I will always be grateful. What surprised me was what he taught me as he was dying. While his words were expectedly sparse, his joy was uncommonly present. He was calm, peaceful, serene, and perfectly content. After a lifetime of being devoted to a Savior, he approached the end of his days fully prepared. He was ready. During his final hours, we watched and listened as he straddled that thin threshold between earth and heaven. It was Elizabeth who had the distinct honor of being with him when she heard him talking to someone on the other side of that threshold. "I'm Eugene," he said, plain as day. "Take me with you." Consequently, and now more than ever, I believe in the resurrection of the body. On the final exam of life, that's the only thing we need to get right. In the fresh wake of grief following the death of my beloved dad, and out of my desire to experience abundant life for myself, I embrace this season of lamentation by singing the blues. Requiem is the soundtrack of my heart. I pray in D minor. But one day, I know this to be true, I will learn the latest God song, and I will sing the Hallelujah chorus once again.
Great. Thank you. You know, obviously there have been times when for you being a pastor has been really tough. You tell a story in one of the letters about being in the sanctuary late at night, and nobody else is around, and you have a conversation with the pulpit, or you find yourself speaking out loud to the pulpit. I love you, I hate you. What was that all about?
Oh, yeah, it is a kind of a love-hate. I mean, I don't think there's much about the Jesus way of life that is or was designed to be easy. And I didn't sign up for easy. I signed up for meaningful. I want my life to be well spent in meaningful, purposeful ways. And so it's not a complaint when things are challenging, hard, difficult, or that are met with obstacles or resistance. I accept that for what it is. But the pulpit, for a shy, introverted person is a pretty intimidating environment. And to actually believe, as I do, that audacious line from the Second Helvetic Confession that the preaching of the Word of God is the Word of God sends my knees knocking every Sunday. It's a terrifying is too strong a word, but it's intimidating. It's bigger than me, and I think it should be. So my relationship with the pulpit is not much different from my relationship with God. It feels like there's wrestling and struggling and pull and push, and sometimes I feel like I'm fully in agreement and assent and I'm obedient, and other times the flesh pulls away and I resist. And preaching every week is, while it's a gift, is a bit burdensome. These Sundays come pretty quickly, one after another, and most Sundays I feel like I have to preach a sermon. Last Sunday, yesterday, I guess. I have to preach a sermon, and I think I was given a sermon to preach, but about 3 or 4 times a year, I have a sermon that I have to preach, where there's a burning. I can't not. I have something I have to say. So as you think about the odds of that, or the percentages of times when I feel like I've got one in me, I'm going to uncork one today. That's only a few times a year. Most of the time, it's just trying to be a steady, faithful mouthpiece conveying God's truth and grace.
Both of these books are really about a kind of an exploration of what it means to be a pastor, what it means to be a church. And specifically, I suppose your identity in the midst of all this is the kind of the letters to a young congregation ends with a story, a letter about a guy who kind of, you're in a ski lift with him or something like that, and you ask him what he does, and he's a Boeing engineer, and he asks you what you do, and you say, well, you're a pastor, and he, what the heck is that? And suddenly you realize how embarrassing this is to try and explain what you do and what you are to a person who has no kind of reference for this kind of life. And that's an interesting thing, isn't it? But I mean, this is obviously an identity that you've embraced. How do you justify this? How do you kind of say what you're about to a secular person?
Yeah, that was a wake up for me to realize, there was a time not that long ago when everyone knew who pastors were, what pastors did. And that was this this moment of realization, like, oh, this is a brave new world. We've entered the age of secularism, and there's a whole demographic of people who are unchurched, and they're a generation or two removed from the gospel. So that just was helpful to realize that, and to help me to more take on the identity of a missionary pastor. That is a kind of an evangelist working in a community, sharing the gospel for the first time, in the case of some people. But the only way I can justify doing this, frankly, is, the only reason I can do it is because I had and have a compelling sense of call. This was not my choice. I did not want to do this. I ran from it as hard and fast as I could for the longest time, until it became so clear to me that to continue to resist would be an act of outright disobedience to the Almighty. And I've got enough fear of the Lord in me to not want to do that. And so when I finally surrendered to it, I fell into what ended up being this tremendous gift, and came to realize that this is actually what I was made for. But I didn't know it until I was embraced by it, pressed into this call. And people started, I think my parishioners started kind of holding up a mirror to me and showing me what they were seeing, helping me to see myself in that way, a way that I just previously couldn't. So again, it feels undeniable to me that this is my calling. I mostly have really good days, feel like this is what I was made for, but that doesn't mean it's easy. There's hard stuff that happens, and as I said earlier, I signed up for the meaningful, and it's really hard to do anything meaningful that's not hard.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Eric, for being with us and for talking about your life, your work, your relationship with your dad, and talking about these two books, Letters to a Young Pastor, Timothy, Conversations Between Father and Son, and Letters to a Young Congregation, Nurturing the Growth of a Faithful Church. Both of these are just out. They're published by Nav Press and available from all good bookshops, especially Regent College Bookstore. Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you for joining us in this conversation. And I hope we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you so much. This was a pleasure for me.